Good morning, this is Mark Smith for History 111, sections 1 through 12, and this sadly is our last lecture for this course. Today we'll be talking about the fighting of the Civil War and emancipation. Let me remind you to familiarize yourself or refamiliarize yourself with the revised syllabus that's posted online. It will give you details about the final examination, which is at 9 o'clock on April the 29th. That's a Wednesday. And you'll have 150 minutes to do it in. And any other relevant details I've listed under the revised syllabus. There's also details about make-up examinations and when they will occur on reading day. But as I say, this is our last lecture for our course, and it is a poignant lecture in many ways, not just because it's our last lecture, although I'm sad to see you go, and I hope to see many of you in the future. It's a poignant lecture because this lecture is a culmination of really certainly the last few weeks, but in many ways a culmination of the very beginning of the course and the founding of colonial America, and all the way through the Revolution up until the beginning of the Civil War. So what I want to do today is talk about the fighting of the war and emancipation, and I'm going to do this in a very particular way. I want to frame this lecture in terms of turning points, and I'll explain what those are in a moment. But essentially, as I go through this, I want you to evaluate what do you think is among or one or several of the most important moments in the fighting of the war. And I'll certainly speak to those issues as I go through them, but really what I want to talk about is kind of pivotal moments in the war. And those pivotal moments, and there are many, but I've elected to identify a handful. So I want to talk about turning points briefly, and then turn our attention to the guts of the matter. I want to talk about First Bull Run, July the 21st, 1861, also known as First Manassas. Then I want to consider a diplomatic event during the war, the Trent Affair, which occurs in the autumn and winter of 1861. Then we'll look at Antietam, or Sharpsburg, in September 1862. Then I'm going to bundle together Gettysburg and Vicksburg of 1863. And then I'm going to consider emancipation and conclude with a commentary, not just on how emancipation came, but how freed people understood emancipation and what freedom really meant in the context of the closing of the Civil War. You'll see that I've posted the outline as usual, and underneath the terms I've given you a small table that compares casualty rates for Union and Confederacy for Antietam and Gettysburg. And I'll draw your attention to those numbers during the lecture when we talk about Antietam and Gettysburg. Now, the thing I want to mention first of all before we get going is this idea of turning points. And this is a clumsy way to look at something like a war, but nonetheless there is a certain truth to it, that wars have these deciding moments in a way. Some of them are structural, some of them are pivotal, but nonetheless we can look back with the benefit of historical hindsight and evaluate, what the really important moments of a war, especially this Civil War, were. And the idea of turning points suggests important junctures in the course of history when a force meets a counterforce with such intensity that a change is possible in the expected direction of historical development. This doesn't mean that things are determined. There's in fact quite a lot of human contingency involved in the idea of turning points. But really what I want you to do is think about the weight of each turning point that I'm going to mention. And in your mind, try to evaluate which one seems to be critically important. They're all important, but perhaps you have a view on which moment was the most important. So that's the idea of turning points, and I use it to frame our understanding of this lecture. So historians have often pointed to First Bull Run, the first major battle of the Civil War, as a turning point. First Bull Run is the Union name, and this was typical throughout the Civil War. The Union named its battles after landmarks and so things like creeks and rivers, hence First Bull Run is a Union name. The Confederacy called this same battle First Manassas, and the Confederacy tended to name its battles after the nearest towns. And it took place on July the 21st, 1861. It takes place obviously after the firing on Sumter, and it takes place after that 90-day call for volunteers issued by Lincoln as a result of that firing on Sumter, and it takes place after Virginia has joined the Confederacy. Because if you recall, Virginia's conditional unionism was contingent on the South not being attacked, and they interpreted Lincoln's 90-day call for militiamen to put down the insurrection or secession as an attack on the South. So we join the Civil War at the very beginning, when the two sides have been delimited and identified, and they are pretty much as they are going to be throughout the Civil War. So First Bull Run. The location is a mere 26 miles southwest of Washington, D.C., and it's in Virginia. And the background of First Bull Run is quite straightforward. Many people on both sides, both on the Confederacy and in the Union, believed that this war would be very short, and leaders in both camps had sort of high confidence that cajoled reluctant generals into taking offensive. The press was very important here. It chivied up the population, and the press kind of didn't push the first battle, but certainly spoke up in favor of a rapid engagement to end this war quickly. From the Union perspective, they thought that this war would be a limited war, that it was designed simply to suppress an insurrection, certainly not to physically destroy the Confederacy, and the Union General-in-Chief, Winfield Scott, simply planned to envelop the South. He called this the Anaconda Plan, named after the large snake. Not really intending to invade the South, but rather to suffocate the South and force its readmission to the Union, force its reconstruction. Now, this Anaconda Plan of Scott's required airtight naval blockading of the southern ports, and it also required the control of the Mississippi River, and also the presence of troops on land to complete the Anaconda. Now, many people in the North thought that this Anaconda Plan was too timid. The New York Tribune, for example, Horace Greeley's mouthpiece, wanted something more emphatic than an Anaconda Plan, and the New York Tribune called forward to Richmond, because at this point the Confederate capital had been relocated from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. And the idea here was to have a quick offensive victory to smash the Confederacy's capital in Richmond and bring a quick and relatively bloodless end to this Civil War. Lincoln thought this was a plan with some merit. He did not want a prolonged war, and he thought that a direct attack on Richmond was the kind of thing that could bring this Civil War to a rapid conclusion. Now, in the South, and for his part, Jefferson Davis was also buffeted by popular pressure. Davis really wanted a war of attrition. He believed that the South could win the war by not really losing it. Hold fast, counterattack at Union weak points, wear out a better equipped foe, a more numerous foe, and essentially force the Union to give up by prolonging the war and making it too costly. This was Jefferson Davis's preferred strategy during the war. But he found himself modifying his plan in the face of popular pressure too, especially from newspaper editors and politicians. They all wanted every part of the Confederate homeland protected, and Davis was forced to scatter his forces thinly as a result. And it was pressures like these that led to the first major battle of the Civil War, First Bull Run, or First Manassas. By early July 1861, we have about 35,000 Union troops gathered in Washington, D.C. Their commander was General Irvin McDowell, who had no direct previous field experience in command. At Lincoln's behest, McDowell drew up a plan to attack the roughly 20,000 Confederates who were stationed at the railroad junction in Manassas, Virginia, and they were under the command of Pierre G.T. Beauregard, the hero of Sumter, as he was styled. The idea for the Union here was very simple. If they could win this battle at Manassas, they could quickly march on to Richmond, which was just down the road, and end the war quickly by capturing the Confederate capital at Richmond. Now, essential to this whole plan was the blocking strategy of Union General Robert Patterson. And Patterson had charge of about 15,000 Federal troops at Harper's Ferry. And his only job here was to prevent about 11,000 Confederate troops under the control of Joseph E. Johnston from reinforcing the Confederate troops at Manassas. So it was really a blocking plan. All he had to do was stop Johnston from reinforcing the existing Confederate troops at Manassas. It wasn't a bad plan overall. It would have been more effective, I think, if McDowell had more experienced troops and officers. And truthfully, McDowell had neither. And McDowell was sensible enough to be worried about the inexperience of his troops especially. And he told Lincoln this, and Lincoln replied, "You are green, it is true, but they are green also. You're all green alike." In other words, Lincoln's saying everybody's inexperienced. Nobody has experienced this kind of war before, and it would cancel itself out. Such was Lincoln's hope. There was another weakness with McDowell's plan, and it wasn't something that he could control. Remember, and I ask you to remember this, that Lincoln's original call for volunteers to fight, for the militia in particular, was for 90 days. And the movement towards Richmond by the Union forces was due to start on July the 16th. And ironically, the 90-day terms of many of the enlistments who were involved in the First Bull Run battle were about to expire at the very beginning of the battle. And in fact, an entire infantry regiment went home on the eve of the Battle of Manassas. There's a psychological effect here. Many of Patterson's troops in particular found their terms about to expire, and the question, of course, was would these men whose enlistment terms were about to expire, would they fight wholeheartedly? As I said, the southern commander at Manassas was Beauregard, and by July the 18th, it was quite clear that Patterson had failed to stop Johnston from reinforcing Beauregard's troops at Manassas. And so basically the Confederates had more troops than they should have done. McDowell himself was very slow to march on Manassas. He was slowed down really not just by his own tendency, but by the movement of his troops who weren't used to carrying such heavy supplies. He outpaced his supply lines. His inexperienced troops dillied and dallied along the way, picking berries and harvesting food. They just weren't used to soldiering. And ultimately, McDowell arrives a little bit too late. to prevent Johnson's reinforcing of Beauregard, and he arrives on July the 21st. Beauregard spreads his troops along the south bank of Bull Run, a sluggish river a few miles north of Manassas, and McDowell attacks there. And bear in mind, the Union forces vastly outnumber the Confederate. We're talking about 10,000 Union soldiers at this point, with roughly 4,500 Confederates. And the sheer weight of the Union numbers pushes the Confederates up the slopes of a place called Henry House Hill. And for a while it looks like McDowell is on the verge of a smashing victory. And we know this because people gathered on hillsides just outside of Manassas using their spyglasses and binoculars. Newspaper men were there to record these events, and it looked like McDowell was going to push Confederate forces up Henry House Hill. And they were doing that. They were pushing them up. And then they suddenly stuttered. They suddenly paused. They didn't go up any further on Henry House Hill because they witnessed and they saw a company, a group of soldiers on the brow of this hill. And this group of soldiers was led by Thomas J. Jackson, a former professor at the Virginia Military Institute. And Jackson's troops stood up on the brow of the hill, and General Barnaby of South Carolina pointed to Jackson's men and shouted something like, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall." We believe that he meant it as a compliment, that Stonewall Jackson's men were there to stop the Union push up Henry House Hill. We'll never know because B was killed just afterwards. But the point is that the appearance of Jackson and his men caused the Union forces to stop and stutter. And one reason why they did is because Jackson's men were wearing blue. They were wearing their Virginia blue. And their uniforms looked very much like the federal uniforms. And so as the Union forces were going up Henry House Hill, they stopped because they thought, or they couldn't be sure, of whose men they were at the top, and they withheld fire for fear of hitting friends and making a mistake. They did make a mistake because these were Jackson's men. These were Confederate forces. And they unleashed shot after shot and drove the Union forces back down Henry House Hill. By middle of the afternoon, the Union front line was losing its cohesion. The Confederates were pushing these troops back, and they began to fall back very rapidly. This in turn turned into a panic retreat. The Confederate units chased the Union forces back about a mile or so beyond Bull Run, but no further. As Johnson said, "Our army was more disorganized by victory than that of the United States by defeat." So this was a significant and resounding Confederate victory, the very first battle of the Civil War. Why was it important? It was important because of the reaction that the Union defeat in this first battle, this first major battle anyway, had in the North. The North reacted to what they called Black Monday. But what it really did was this loss inspired the Union to support the war with a ever greater determination. And volunteering accelerated as a result of their loss at First Bull Run. On the 24th of July, Lincoln was empowered to remove officers for incompetency. So that gave Lincoln a greater authority over who was going to do the fighting in this war. And it allowed Lincoln to introduce what was known as the First Confiscation Act in August 1861. And the loss at First Bull Run really inspired this First Confiscation Act, And the first Confiscation Act was important because it really represented the very first gesture, the very first wedge into the idea that emancipation would be part of this war. And I'm just going to read you part of the first Confiscation Act because you'll see that it's not really emancipation as such, but it's the beginnings of emancipation, emancipation being inserted into this war, that it ends up making emancipation a possibility. So this first Confiscation Act in August 1861, barely a month after the Union loss, the first Confiscation Act is a Union policy, and it's in direct reaction to their loss at First Bull Run. And here's some of what the first Confiscation Act said. It said the amendment provides that if any person held to service or labor in any state under the laws thereof, by which of course is meant a slave in any of these states, if a slave is employed in aid of this rebellion in digging ditches or entrenchments, or if used for carrying guns, or if used to destroy this Union government by the consent of his master shall forfeit all right to him, and he shall be forever freed. So what this is really saying is that if the Confederates use slave labor to prosecute the war, if they use slave labor to dig trenches, to haul guns and ammunition, if that slave were captured, then the slave would be free. What this represents is the thin end of emancipation by legislation. Okay, so this first Confiscation Act gestures towards that, and that's why First Bull Run is quite important. It's also important, the loss was also important for Lincoln because it allows him to reorganize his military campaign. He makes its planning much more rigorous. He tightens the blockade, he strengthens his forces, and he replaces McDowell with George B. McClellan, who is considered to be a superior military organizer. And McClellan's appointment really boosts Union morale, and McClellan himself begins to shape the Union Army into an efficient fighting machine. What was the reaction to the victory at First Bull Run in the South? Largely psychological. It inspired a degree of cockiness and complacency, really. But also, and importantly, it created Southern heroes, especially Jackson. And in the process, it created a sense of Southern identity. Bear in mind, this Confederacy had just been invented. And so this victory allowed for an esprit de corps, a sense of identity to emerge. And I think that Bull Run both hurt and helped the South, and hurt and helped the North. But you can see there are very real implications and results of the Confederate victory at First Manassas. So that's one important event in the war. Let me turn to the next important event, and that was known as the Trent Affair. This happens in late 1861, in the autumn and winter of 1861. The background to this, and this is a diplomatic issue more than anything else, the background for this is that from the Confederates' point of view, it was important to be recognized internationally as a sovereign or proper nation. And they especially wanted this recognition from Britain, because if Britain recognized the Confederacy as a sovereign nation, then they might eventually side with the Confederacy, which would of course increase their chances of victory over the Union Army. The North desperately wanted to avoid this. They did not want foreign recognition of the Confederacy, and so they were always very worried about British recognition and support of the Confederacy. From Lincoln's perspective, the Confederacy was no such thing. It was merely a bunch of rebels and insurrectionists. And under international law, he wanted them to be recognized just as rebels, because if they were ever recognized as a sovereign country, they would be granted under international law the status of a belligerent power. And what this basically would do is allow nations to trade with the Confederacy and therefore help them in their prosecution of the war against the federal government. In May 1861, at the very beginning of the Civil War, Britain announces its official position, and that is one of neutrality. And that's an interesting position because neutrality is a kind of tacit and implicit recognition that the Confederacy might be an actual country, and it was recognizing the Confederacy really as a belligerent nation. And this was deeply disconcerting to the Union because it would allow the Confederacy to buy arms from neutral nations. This is still in process. It hasn't been fully recognized yet by the British, but it looks like this new neutrality proclamation is going to be of some help to the Confederacy. In September 1861, the Confederate government, very anxious to secure British support, sends 2 envoys to London and to Paris. They send James Mason of Virginia to London and John Slidell of Louisiana to Paris. And Mason and Slidell, their basic jobs is really to lobby the governments of Britain and France to recognize the sovereignty, or at least the belligerent nation status of the Confederacy. Now, to reach there, Mason and Slidell have to leave Charleston, South Carolina on a blockade runner because, as I said, the Union has blockaded southern ports. And they manage to get through. They go to Havana, they change ship, and they go onto a British steamer called the Trent. And it is the Trent that is supposed to take them to London and to Paris. So they manage to escape through the blockade, through Charleston. They go to Havana, and then they transfer onto the British steamer, the Trent. Now, the United States Navy is terribly embarrassed that they had failed to intercept Mason and Slidell en route to Havana, and a U.S. Navy captain called Charles Wilkes decides to redeem the U.S. Navy's reputation, and with his 13-gun sloop, the USS San Jacinto, Wilkes stops the British steamer, the Trent, on November the 8th. He arrests Mason and Slidell and lets the Trent go on her way. This was a silly thing to do, because essentially what had happened is that the United States had interfered with a British ship. And from the British perspective, this was tantamount to piracy. The Americans had stopped a British ship, arrested Mason and Slidell, but in the process had threatened British sovereign power. And the British press, as is often its inclination, clamoured for retribution, for war, and even the Prime Minister, Viscount Palmerston, told his cabinet, "You may stand for this, but damned if I will." So there was a great reaction in Britain, and they wanted some compensation of some sorts. The British cabinet voted to send Washington, D.C. an ultimatum demanding an apology and release of the Confederate diplomats. And at the same time, Britain also ordered troops to Canada, which is still British at this time, and they strengthened their British Western Atlantic fleet. In other words, war with Britain and the North seemed, well, quite possible at this point in time over this Trent affair. Lincoln proved wise, one war at a time, he said. He couldn't possibly expect to take on the Confederacy and Great Britain and expect to win in the winter of 1861. To defuse this problem, he decided to yield Mason and Slidell on the grounds that Wilkes had broken international law. The press supported that in the North, so did Britain, and war was avoided. The significance of this event is that had the Union not returned Mason and Slidell, had they not diffused this crisis, it's very possible that the Union would have lost this civil war quite early on. And Lincoln knew this. And he knew this because he needed something from Great Britain. And what he needed was saltpeter. saltpeter being the principal ingredient of gunpowder. And the main source of saltpeter for the Union was British India. And in fact, Lincoln recognized the importance of Britain's saltpeter stockpiles and India's provision of them, that much earlier on, even before the Trent crisis, Washington had sent an envoy to secure as much saltpeter as possible. And when the Trent crisis exploded, no pun intended, there was a rather large shipment of saltpeter waiting in London to be transported to New York. And so from Lincoln's perspective, had he not resolved this Trent crisis, he would not have got his saltpeter, which means that he would not have had his gunpowder, which means he could not have effectively fought the Confederacy. Secondly, Lincoln also recognized that it would have been quite foolish for him to not apologize, for the Union not to resolve this problem, because he feared that the British would in fact go to war against the Union. And he was quite right to fear this, because the British Admiralty, the British military had in fact devised a plan if this Trent crisis was not going to be resolved. And the plan was very simple. In the absence of a Union apology over the Trent fiasco, the British military and navy planned to destroy the Union blockade of all southern ports, in turn blockade all northern ports, and then lastly send troops down from Canada to coordinate with the Confederacy and catch Union forces in something of a pincer movement from the north and the south. And Lincoln recognized that, and he recognized he couldn't possibly win a war against Britain and the Confederacy at the same time. So I think that the Trent affair is a good example of avoiding the problem, and it mattered. It mattered a great deal. Our third aspect, our third turning point, if you will, is Antietam, September the 17th, 1862. This is also known, if you're a Confederate at this time, as Sharpsburg. It's 1 mile north of Sharpsburg, Maryland. The best way to understand Antietam is that this is a plan by Robert E. Lee. And what Lee wants to do is he wants to invade Maryland, where he expected a pro-Southern uprising, because Maryland was very conflicted. Some of it was Union, some of it was Confederate. And what he was trying to do here was invade Maryland, win a major battle, inspire a pro-Confederate uprising in Maryland, and that in turn, believed Lee, would alter the upcoming elections in the autumn of 1862 that would in turn force the Union to sue for peace. So Lee really saw this invasion as an invasion for peace, and essentially allow the Confederates to negotiate their own terms for Confederate independence. As Lee was planning this invasion for peace, there are events in the North and Britain that are going to make the outcome of Antietam quite important. In the North, we have growing radicalism. We have lots of Union military failures, mounting financial costs, abridgments of civil liberties. But you also had a growing radical Republican contingent whose voices were being heard in the North, and they were gradually calling for some kind of emancipation proclamation that could be woven into the aim of the Union war effort to strengthen their cause militarily. And in fact, known only to very few people, Lincoln in the spring of 1862 had already resolved to adopt an emancipation policy as part of the war. And it was William H. Seward, his Secretary of State, that advised Lincoln to postpone proclaiming emancipation until he could give it to the country backed by some kind of military success. And Lincoln agreed. He recognized that to make emancipation as part of the war effort, he needed to have a military success. And that's why Antietam becomes quite important. In Britain at the same time, Britain is still toying with the idea of recognizing the Confederate nation. And Palmerston says, before Antietam, if the Federals lose a major battle, we might well recognize the Confederacy. But if the Confederates lose a major battle, we should probably withdraw any recognition of Confederate nationhood. The Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, on September the 17th, 1862, is the bloodiest day of the Civil War. Not the bloodiest battle, but the bloodiest day. And you can see from the terms and the table I've given you, a 23% casualty rate for the Confederacy on this one day, a 15% casualty rate for the Union. This is a very nasty, bloody battle. We have about 2,700 Confederates killed, 9,000 wounded, 2,000 missing. We have just over 2,000 Union soldiers killed, 9,500 wounded, 750 missing. We're talking about a lot of carnage here. McClellan doesn't use his full strength the first day, but Lee does remain in possession of the field after the battle, and it looks like something of a Confederate victory initially. But Lee is fully aware that McClellan has new refreshments, as it were, reinforcements, fresh reinforcements arriving that night. And so on the second night, Lee recrosses the Potomac and returns to the safety of Virginia. In a technical sense, this really was a stalemate. There was no obvious winner. Lee had taken the field, but he retreats. However, the perception is sometimes more important than reality. The initial Northern reaction is that McClellan had saved the country from Lee's invasion. He was only criticized really later. But it looked like the Union forces were doing quite well. They had reorganized their army. They had frustrated Lee. They had forced the great Robert E. Lee to retreat. And in the process of this retreat by Lee at Antietam, after this very bloody battle, Britain dropped the idea of mediation, i.e. they dropped the idea of recognizing Confederate nationhood. And, importantly, Antietam is a strong enough victory, I'm going to use the term loosely, but it is a strong enough victory that gives Lincoln the feel-good factor to announce emancipation. And he does, in fact, use Antietam to announce emancipation as a justification for prolonging this war. And emancipation essentially injects a moral purpose for the Union to continue to fight this war. So Antietam is important insofar as it causes Britain to drop the idea and certainly pause the idea of recognizing the Confederacy, and also provides the justification for the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln then announces following Antietam. And all of this, of course, brings us to Gettysburg and Vicksburg, both in the summer of 1863. Gettysburg has conventionally been regarded as a really important turning point of the Civil War. It was the victory that won the war for the Union. But historians increasingly have paused and suggested that Antietam might have been more consequential because it produced two major results: the British abandonment, essentially, of the Confederate position and the introduction of emancipation. But this does not mean to say that Gettysburg was not important. It was. Because at Gettysburg, Lee made a deeper penetration of the North than he did at any other time in the war. This was the high tide of the Confederacy. This was the Confederacy's northernmost offensive. And secondly, as a military engagement, the three-day battle at Gettysburg was the greatest battle of the Civil War. If Antietam was the bloodiest day of the war, Gettysburg was by far the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Its numbers were just colossal. And you can see the percentages on the table that I gave you. Tens of thousands of people injured, killed, wounded. We're talking about carnage on an unprecedented scale. But Lee lost Gettysburg. If Antietam had meant British kind of postponement of intervention or stepping away a bit, Gettysburg absolutely drove the nail in the coffin. Britain abandoned the idea for good that it would ever intervene on the side of the Confederacy, that it would ever recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. Lee's loss at Gettysburg absolutely dissuaded the British from being invested in any shape or form in a Confederate future. Gettysburg also deflated Southern optimism more than any other battle. It really knocked the wind out of the Confederacy, both militarily but also in popular opinion. And while Lee was not really blamed for Antietam, he was for Gettysburg, and he wasn't forgiven for it. So it was a very important battle. Whether or not it was as important as Antietam is up for you to decide, I suppose, but let's not dismiss the importance of Gettysburg. Now, Vicksburg was a different kettle of fish, but arguably terribly important. Vicksburg, Mississippi, May 1863. It's on the Mississippi River. This is the western theater of the war. Gettysburg is the eastern theater. This occurs in the western theater. Essentially, what Ulysses S. Grant did at Vicksburg was to expose the South at a level and in a way that it had not been exposed before. And the story is well known, so I won't dwell on it too much. But fundamentally, Vicksburg was a siege that starved the Confederacy and the Southern civilians in the city of Vicksburg. It did such an effective job that following the bombardment of Vicksburg, there was essentially a surrender of the city by the Confederates, and Grant took the city of Vicksburg. Now you might ask, why is one city so important? Well, a reasonable question. This city was important. It was important because the capturing of Vicksburg by Union forces, by Grant, allowed for the Union free navigation of the Mississippi River. That means that they could go wherever they wanted down into the Confederacy. Capturing Vicksburg was also important because it allowed Union forces to control the railroad connections that emanated from Vicksburg that went throughout the entire Confederacy. And essentially, what capturing Vicksburg meant is that Union forces would now have the advantage of what were known as interior lines, that they could use a vast swath of people, thousands of soldiers, to invade the South in the very guts of the South using a smaller numeric force but with much greater tactical advantage. And that's precisely what happens. With the fall of Vicksburg, Grant essentially gives over the command of the invasion of the South to Sherman, who now ventures into the South and marches through the guts of the South, and as we know in South Carolina, coming through Georgia, coming through Columbia, the city is burned, and fundamentally the fall of Vicksburg allows for the psychological destruction of the Southern citizenry, and ergo the beginning of the end of the war for the South has been recognized. I want to conclude with emancipation. And emancipation is important in many ways. It is Antietam, as I said, that allows Lincoln to issue the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, which is going to be in effect on New Year's Day 1863. Now, it's important to recognize that the Emancipation Proclamation does not free all slaves of the Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation exempts some states, such as Tennessee, Louisiana, and Virginia, on the grounds that the Union largely controls these areas, so they're not considered to be in a state of rebellion. All that the Emancipation Proclamation does is it declares free all slaves who are still in states of rebellion, effective on January the 1st, 1863. So, ironically, the very places where the slaves could have been freed, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Virginia, where there was significant Union forces, they're not freed. And the places where they could have, they were freed, at least in a legislative, technical sense, were places very difficult for the Union to get to. But what this does, this Emancipation Proclamation, is rhetorically alter the posture of the war. This war now becomes a war for freedom. And that's why the Emancipation Proclamation is important. It is not until the 13th Amendment of 1865 that enslaved people are formally freed. But that 13th Amendment is a constitutional amendment that outlaws slavery in the United States, and it's premised on the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which, of course, was also built on the First Confiscation Act. So it's important because the Emancipation Proclamation made freedom, the freedom of 3.8 million people, part and parcel of this war. And that's why it's important. And that was formally recognized in the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment in 1865. But what I want to finish with is a kind of brief meditation on the human side of emancipation. We know that the Confederacy loses, and I've kind of gone through some of the reasons why that is the case. But the flip side is, what did freedom mean? What did freedom mean for almost 4 million people? And I think the point to stress here is that there were many meanings of freedom. And once enslaved people had heard and learned that they had been in fact freed, they tried to exercise their freedom in a variety of ways. What were those ways? Well, in a way, defining freedom was quite complicated. Some of them, the first thing they did was rename themselves. They had never had the right to name themselves. They had been named after their masters and mistresses, and they threw off those names once they had been told that they were free. And so they took names that were meaningful to them and that they owned themselves. And as you might expect, they chose their last names with great care, and a very common last name for emancipated slaves was, of course, freedman. So renaming themselves was one way that they defined their freedom following the Civil War in particular. Another way that they defined their freedom, that they articulated what freedom meant to them, was they moved. Some of them just left the plantation. Some of them didn't go very far at all. They left the plantation and came back sometimes, just because they could move. For the first time in their lives, they could physically move. Slavery had always kept them under a pass system or very close to the plantation. So one way that they defined the meaning of freedom to them was literally taking to the roads. Some of them went down the road and came back, but a lot of others left the plantation altogether. And where did they go? They often went to southern urban places, towns and cities. And in fact, between 1865 and 1870, the 5 years after the Civil War, you see the black population of the South's 10 largest cities doubling. they go to cities. They go to cities because they have opportunity there. They can find work. They have more freedom. They have more independence. And so they go to southern cities. Now, much later in the 20th century, they will go to northern cities. But for now, they stay in southern cities because they can show that they can move. How else did they define their freedom? They reunited with family members who had been sold during slavery, and if you read newspaper accounts from just after the Civil War, you will see these incredibly poignant adverts for sons and daughters and wives and husbands that had been sold during slavery. They're trying to reunite their families. And as I said on the lecture on the enslaved, families were terribly important as a self-sustaining mechanism for the slave family. Others embraced religion, practiced their own religion outside of the dictates of white society, and you see the growth of the African Methodist Episcopal Church immediately after the Civil War. So the freedom of religion and expression is terribly important, and one way that people defined their freedom was to embrace their religion. Of course, another way that freed people defined their freedom was through embracing education. They had been denied education. They had been denied the right to read and the ability to learn to read. And so one of the first things they did was go to the written and spoken and read word in an effort to educate themselves and an effort to make themselves more independent. And then lastly, and interestingly, I think many freed people came to define their freedom and their independence in a way that had veined American history, certainly just before the Revolution and certainly after the American Revolution, because for many freed people, the only guarantee of liberty in this new post-bellum world was the ownership of land. If they had land, then they could exercise their liberty. If they had land, they could exercise their freedom. And what they wanted was land more than anything else. The federal government never gave them the land that they wanted. So for many generations thereafter, African Americans worked extraordinarily hard to secure land. The reason they wanted land is because ultimately they were the last Jeffersonians. They understood that land was liberty. Land was the guarantee of independence. And in that sense, the emancipation of almost 4 million people during the Civil War gave voice to a very powerful American association between landed independence, liberty, and freedom. That ends our course on History 111. It's been a pleasure teaching you. It's been an odd semester, one that will go into history in many ways. I'm sorry that I didn't get to see you the entire semester, but I do hope to see you on campus. Please do say hello when we reconvene in the autumn, and I would certainly welcome any and all of you into any other class that I teach at the University of South Carolina. So it's been my privilege and my honor, and as I usually say, stay safe. Thank you.